Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. I'm just going to take a moment and just remember to like the video, share, subscribe to the channel. You can share it on social media to bring some more folks in here to hear this great conversation. Um, Say hi from Gorilla History Pod, who said to say hi to our guests today, who will be on an upcoming episode of their podcast as well. Shout out to them as well. I heard that Brett and Dave are temporarily kind of parting ways. They'll still be working together, but they do great work. And shout out to Brett from Rev Left Radio. Um, and so today, I'm really excited to be talking with this person. So our guest today will be Matteo Capasso, and we'll be talking about his book, Everyday Politics in the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya. Um, I probably messed up the pronunciation of that, but he will correct me in a minute. He's the editor of Middle East Critique, author of this book. He's also a Mary Curie Global Fellow between Foscari University of Venice, Italy, and Columbia University in the city of New York. There's more that we could say about him, and we'll give him a chance to talk about himself a little bit through this work. But really, before this is somebody that I would like to have multiple conversations with. I think he does very interesting work, and really enjoyed reading this book. And so, before we got into further conversations, wanted to bring him on because we really haven't had any meaningful. I mean, Libya is definitely a topic that's come up over the years on the podcast, as is Gaddafi. But we really haven't had any meaningful discussion about Libya. And his book is really, I definitely recommend it for anybody who wants to, understand Libya, understand the years leading up to the so-called Arab Spring, which in Libya is, a whole different. Anyways, we talk about that a little bit too. But anyways, Matteo, welcome to the stage. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, good afternoon, good morning, salam alaikum to everybody who's following us. It's a pleasure to be here. And I forgot, buon pomeriggio.
Right on. Well, welcome. It's great to be in conversation with you. And let's just start like talking about and this may preempt some of the other things I would want to ask you, but you reference like a number of individuals in the acknowledgments who contributed to this journey for you. Obviously I know books like this take years of research and interviews. You did a lot of interviewing people to put this together. And so I'm just interested in you talking a little bit about the project itself and, kind of what brought you to it, and then how things kind of changed and developed through doing this project for you.
Thanks, Jared. I mean, I'm gonna start somewhere, then perhaps you can pick it up and take it to another direction because I'm all right. Let's try to do it in this way because so where does it start? It's obvious that the project is part of what was my doctoral research project. But obviously, to understand how I got to study this, somehow also I have to go through my personal trajectory, which is my, getting close to study the Middle East in a way, which comes from, I have to say, from the possibility of having had a good teacher back in the days who introduced me to one of the most glaring injustice in the world, which still remains today, which is Palestine. And from Palestine, that's how I was introduced to the so-called region of the Middle East. And we're talking about the years of the global war on terror. We're talking about all these years of, crazy Muslims. We need to fight them. And it was right after the aftermath of 9/11. So as I'm growing up and I'm seeing this violence happening in the region and the Islamophobia in our society, and then I get, I get the chance also to start understanding what is happening in Palestine. Also, as a European, we have to remember this, that you are bombed with with the Holocaust tragedy, and then all of a sudden you're faced with another reality that you can't quite make sense, but slowly you want to make sense because you're curious, you want to understand about the world. And as I was about to start, my MA studies, I was in the middle of it actually. Then you have the so-called big protests in the Arab region, and including Libya. And I was young, I couldn't make sense of everything back at the time. I was young. I was also politically and I knew, I was curious about the world, but I didn't know as much as I think I understand, or I still try to figure out about the world as I do now, collectively with the other people. So as things unfold, as like Tunisia goes, the government in Tunisia goes down, and then protests start in Egypt, and Libya is taking a very violent direction. A friend of mine tells me, why don't you study Libya? Why don't you study Gaddafi, such a crazy guy? And he gives me the Green Book. And I honestly had studied before the history of colonialism, Italian colonialism, which is very violent, with the setup of concentration camps in Libya. But I had no idea about post-colonial Libya. I had no idea what Libya was about. Yeah, probably I heard about Gaddafi and his visit in Rome in 2008. I heard about, crazy Gaddafi, or the fact that he had shares in Juventus or Fiat, like the Libyan dictators and so on and so forth, because that's what the mainstream media were telling me. So I start approaching the literature slowly, and I eventually write a very, short this MA thesis, which is followed up with a proposal for a PhD. And that's where, that's where the trajectory starts now. Why? Because the initial proposal was, and I'm very honest about this, was actually to study resistance in Libya, to understand how Libya got to 2011. So how were people trying to, to overthrow the regime? Why did I start from there? Because that's something that I learned by moving forward with the years. What I realized was that there was a literature, the Arab region and the Middle East had been studied up to 2010 according to this paradigm or authoritarianism. So these regimes are in power, they're crushing the people. We need to study how do they manage to stay in power for so long, and so on and so forth. Then 2011 takes place, and you have this counter wave of studies about social movements, resistance, revolt, protest, to the extent that it's not just romanticized, but it's excessive, because in every action of people, they start seeing something, the seeds of resistance, the seeds of revolt. They needed to explain to themselves, the scholars included, obviously, how did we miss this? And we needed to look at every nitty-gritty aspect of the quotidian life of people. So that's where the everyday comes in. And initially, that was my understanding. And then you can imagine in the university, even in a place like Italy, where we had people like Gramsci or Losurdo, which are completely diluted in the way they are taught, if they're taught, you're just bombed with post-structural theory. And that's important, because the two things come together. As I'm trying to understand the Arab region, I am presented with post-structural theory. So, the individual, the question of agency, psychoanalysis, James Scott, Foucault. And this is very, very important, because it frames the concepts, the way you're looking at the world, and then you try to understand the world. And so, and Zizek, it's and Butler, and so on and so forth. And it's not, I don't want to now start demonizing everything, but what I'm trying to get at here. So this is what guided initially my proposal and my analysis. But then, I also get, and I start, apart from some personal meetings that were very important for me on a personal and intellectual level, including my partner, what I found is that I look up of books of Arab thinkers like Samir Amin, Ali Qadri, and they're saying something very, very different from what these post-structural theories are trying to tell me. And it actually makes sense. Also because as I was trying to speak to the people that are interviewed in this book, there was this kind of, something, it doesn't come back. It's not quite clear. But I think the key aspect of this is that once I finished my PhD, and then I wanted to turn this PhD into a book, I think it was the review process that really brought me to not to change the analysis completely, because it was already, aligned in a certain direction, but it just made me realize how much what was not being said was necessarily for me to say. And and the review process is important, because as any book, this any manuscript has a life beyond its pages. You can't just it comes within a structure. And that structure is the structure of the academia. That structure is the political economy of books, of presses, and ideas that allow these presses also to continue and have their clout of academic, power, and so on and so forth. So I'm approached by a UK big university press. I send a manuscript, but the manuscript is rejected on the basis of the fact that I had personally what I consider now, looking back, a very mild critique of NATO. And I am told, the author, and I am quoting here because I still have them, the review, and trust me, I was very disappointed, not to say pissed, when I read these reviews. I am told that the author should be reminded that without NATO, without the intervention of NATO, he might not have a book now, because the idea was I wouldn't have been able to interview people.
Like that's the most important thing, right? That you have a book.
Yes.
Thank you, NATO. You have a book.
Yes, thank you, NATO. You have a book. Basically, yes. Yeah. I mean, and then there was the whole fact that I was trying to be what I consider balanced in my analysis of what happened, before 2011, and all these kinds of comments that instead were referring to, the author should probably understand this and that. It was political. Politics were there right at the first, probably even naive on my side, but on my first encounter with really the world of serious publishing, of putting together your own ideas. Well, after being rejected, and I'm very thankful for Syracuse University Press, who decided to embrace this project, because not everybody, is willing to do that, especially when it comes to university presses. I decided to push the analysis a little bit more. And as you can see in the book, the idea, started to look for resistance and agency, but then all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, gradually I realized that the everyday is just a dialectical partner to, a structure in which it is part of. And so, I basically developed a dialectical way to understand the everyday in the book that, it becomes clear then eventually when you start reading it.
Yeah, right on. I love that. Thank you for sharing some of that. I mean, I think the discussion of being bombarded with the post-structural theory is like something that I've talked to a lot of you know, my folks, my friends and comrades that are in grad school, and they're like trying to do they're like, "Oh, I want to do historical materialism." And you know, they're like, "Oh, they tell you look at Foucault, like look at the, do this, and uh anyway, I just think that experience is one that a lot of folks share. And it's yeah, so anyways, and it's interesting to hear that with regard to um Italy, in terms of what you said, in terms of Gramsci,
Yeah.
and in terms of Lucerto, especially, because he's like super critical of all this shit. um yeah, so anyways, I appreciate that. So let's see, let's go continue a little bit with something you started talking about, which is kind of your approach to the everyday, because I do think that the everyday is a very important thing to examine, to try to understand with any society, any social situation. um and yet there's also this problem that I find a lot of times with people who use these kind of frameworks, where you use the term methodological nationalism, and I think that's a really good term. It happens a lot within the U.S., within certain strains of ethnic studies and things like this too. It happens a lot with I know like books written by authors about other countries where they'll
Mhm.
just look at the everyday politics within them. Like say if you wrote a book about Venezuela, right, and or Cuba, right, and you just talked about the internal politics there and like certain forms of repression or what the state's doing, and you don't look at what's happening at all at the international level where these states are situated, issues like sanctions. And so talk a little bit about how you kind of approached that, methodologically, and kind of why you think it's important to pair an analysis of the everyday with also these different levels of what's going on nationally, what's going on internationally.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jared, to describe the ways in which the everyday as a methodological and a conceptual tool has been used, and unfortunately continues to be used. The idea is that, and again, we have to go back to the liberal nature of the world in which we live in, which is, there is this idea of agency. You look at the everyday to look at the individual. You look at the everyday and the quotidian life to see how people are trying to survive. And it really goes back to to the work of anthropologists like James Scott, with only after I did my PhD, I found out he was writing reports for the CIA. And this is something that, I wish I would have been told, because all this uh, scholars that I met throughout my life, they were, everybody was so excited about James Scott that, oh, well, look, he's showing how people are resisting. Sure, but probably it's trying to also get a sense of the dynamics inside societies that are very very useful to, to some powers, especially to the US government. So, and this is something also I'll talk about when I got into to study the everyday myself. But anyway, the idea for me is that the everyday was used exactly in that manner. So when I approached the literature, to take the everyday and do something else with it was not definitely a given. On the contrary, what made me realize that the every day was not enough was precisely my opening up to another kind of literature, which is the one I can see even in the back of one of your shelves. There seems to be Arab Development Denied of Dr. Ali Al-Qadri. Is precisely the idea that we need to understand the world in the totality of the social relations. And that means that the everyday cannot be divorced, delinked from the structural conditions in which we live. Now, this is important. It's important because it means that when you're looking at the everyday, you are looking at the everyday. That's how I did it. I look at the everyday as a rhythm of history. I was looking at history. That's what the everyday was for me. It was a level of the quotidian that in which the global was surfacing as well. So the mundane is directly connected to the structural condition and hierarchies in which we live. Even more so if you are in a country of the Arab world that has a unique integration within the structural world order. And so you need to understand that the dynamics that develop at the everyday level, they have a direct connection with the changes at the global ones. And I mean, this kind of division between everyday and global somehow makes us think that these are two separate spheres of analysis. But the idea that I try to convey in the book is precisely that if you're looking in terms of a dialectical relationship, it means that it's convenient for us to explain things as global, everyday, and regional or national. But these are categories that ultimately all come together when you are describing the laws of development, the motor and engine of that drives history. And Libya was part of that. Obviously, you can go into the details of some aspect and so on and so forth, as I've done throughout the book. But overall, there are structures that you cannot, forget to take into account when you study a country like Libya, being, imperialism and the geopolitical order in which, the Arab world and the global South itself is integrated in.
Yeah, right on. So let's get into Libya a little bit. I mean, one of the things you do in the introduction, you kind of lay out, and then you go through it throughout the piece. But there's these frames that we have, right? We have the rogue state, we have statelessness, which is an interesting one. I want to hear more to you about kind of how this why Libya gets described as stateless. But also, of course, Gaddafi, the authoritarianism, question that comes up all the time and is, I mean, obviously from Western, I mean, that's what we're programmed, right? The things that you said early on, in terms of these are the images we have. Um, and yeah, so maybe just to start us off, like talk about some of the things that each of these frames, some of the problems with these frames, some of the things that you initially or in doing the work are like this doesn't actually work, and these are some of the issues with it. I know there's lots of them, and that could be a long conversation, but that's kind of what we'll do throughout this anyway. So go ahead.
Yes, I mean, that's what I lay out in the first chapter of the book, which was in a way also what I saw coming out, emerging in the literature by doing, by reading the literature on Libya, especially from an Anglophone side of the world, cultural, intellectual world. So what I found was a Libya that was mainly described through what I call a triptych, I mean, in the book, which is basically three main ideas, the tropes that are constantly coming back when you read the history, the political history of modern Libya. The first one is the idea of statelessness, as you were saying. Now, the idea of statelessness is quite interesting because it doesn't just cover the modern history of Libya, the post-colonial moment, but it's one that is used to describe Libya from the Ottoman time up to the present, actually. I mean, right now, it still comes back, this idea of stateless. Statelessness means that throughout the historical period, Libya has not seen the establishment of functioning democratic institutions, basically a state, in the same way that it happened across Europe and the modern Western world. So it's a very convenient and very ideological conceptual category that others Libya. Basically, the idea is to create, to portray Libya as a society that is lacking and missing something. In that case, what is missing is a government. So there is no government, and what do we have then if there is no government, if there is no state? And that's what this is where there is a double, two sides of the same coin from the second trope, which is authoritarianism. Why? Because when there is no state, then there are tribes. Sorry for the finger. When there is no state, then there are tribes. But if there are tribes, who's going to rule over the tribes? One man. And that one man is the authoritarian ruler. So the idea of authoritarianism is that you had not state, the stateless part, substituted by the idea of one repressive authoritarian ruler controlling the tribes and the country, the people. In doing that, the idea that you're passing on and on to those who are reading is that there is no legitimate and democratic relation between the people and the government, because everything is coming from a top-down situation, dynamic, through a top-down dynamic of an authoritarian ruler controlling the people in a very repressive manner. The last one, which is connected to a fourth one that I talk about in chapter 4, is the idea of rogue state. So you have no state, crazy guy at the top who wants to fund terrorism all over the world. How does he do that? To the idea of rentier state, the oil revenues. So it's mainly four, we could say, kind of conceptual categories that in another work that I did subsequently, an article I wrote, I found and I traced in the case of Venezuela. So you could see Libya and Venezuela really being described in the academic literature. I'm talking about especially politics and international relations exactly in the same way. So what we're seeing is non-state. The revolution comes in and creates a situation where the people are severed from the government. It's just a very authoritarian, repressive situation. Oil revenues, like no control. And this crazy guy who just wants to, fund international terrorism all over the world. now and I'll close, and after this I'll close. What I found interesting in my current work, where I'm working more on archives of the US State Department, CIA, and I'm trying to reconstruct the Libyan archives. What I found interesting is that to me was an intellectual, scholarly vision and framing of Libya was exactly the same in CIA, repeated and reused in CIA documents. So this is where you see the military academic complex and industrial coming together precisely through frame, and now and this has now become very useful to the think tanks that after the destruction of Libya have jumped on the production of knowledge of the country, because now the country is in conflict and needs peace. So, the think tanks are coming to provide, to set the ground to provide more militarized policies towards the country.
Yeah, that intersection you were talking about in terms of the military industrial complex and sort of, I guess, US deep state and things like that, and the academy is a very interesting one. I mean, we're right now doing a study group on the counterinsurgency field manual that the Army and Marines and now everybody uses, but it was originally just the Army and the Marines in the US. And like it's all, it's multidisciplinary. It's like it's got media folks involved, it has academics, but also the academics that are involved were often like special forces dudes who like did like anthropological work at the same time as they're fucking like arming death squads or whatever. Like it's just like it's crazy stuff. And so yeah, I'd be interested to see kind of like your that project that you're working on now, and where that goes, because yeah, it's a mess. Um, so one of the things you lay out in this, because you're really looking at the specific period of time, you're looking at a couple decades, maybe a little more, leading up to 2011. But you do a good job in the book of kind of laying a foundation, and I didn't have all of this, and you kind of concisely lay out a little bit of what does Libya look like post-revolution in the early period? What are some of the achievements, the changes that come about? And then obviously that process becomes sort of, we could use different terms, defeated, degraded, whatever. But could you lay a little bit of that background for people? Because I don't want to assume that people have much of that.
Yeah, I mean, that part is important, because it is true. The book focuses mainly in the last 2 decades, mostly leading up to 2011. So very late 80s, 90s sanctions, and then this new regime, regime coming up in the 2000s, which eventually brings up to 2011. But the revolution comes in 1969. So the book cannot provide, and again, we go back to the conceptual category, cannot provide a static, abstract picture that is devoid of history. You need to understand the historical process through which the book enters the 1980s. And how does the book enter the late 1980s? It does by looking also back at what had happened in the previous years. So in 1969, Libya, in 1951, Libya is after World War II, the collapse of the Italian fascist empire and the defeat of the Nazis by the Red Army. I always have to say that. Libya is put together by the United Nations in 1951 by uniting three main regions of which they are Cyrenaica, Fezzan, and Tripolitania, under the control of the monarchy led by the Senussi monarch, and the country is heavily occupied by the British and the French. By 1969, there is a revolution, which is directly tied and organically connected to the ideology that was spreading in the region, Pan-Arabism. And Libya has, there is a bloodless coup d'etat that takes to power this 26 young officer from the military who bring forward this military operation codenamed Jerusalem in honor of the Palestinian cause. And they launch a whole series of economic and political reforms that are not unique to Libya. I mean, anybody who studied that period that goes, under the name of decolonization from the 1950s to the 1970s, realizes that there were three main principles guiding the period of decolonization. First and foremost, there was the idea of national liberation. We want our own independence. Second one was the realization that self-determination could not happen without an undoing of the international order. So what we could call anti-imperialism, so national liberation, anti-imperialism, and then how are we going to get what is the strategy to achieve these goals, these two goals, is regional solidarity. So what we see are exactly these three kind of principles being applied by the Libyan government right after 1969. And so we have at the national level and economic level, you have a process of land reform. Private property is abolished. The oil industry is nationalized. The foreign military bases are shut off. Libya is one of the pioneers in terms of renegotiating the oil contracts with the multinationals together with Iran back in the days. And they spearhead also the idea that oil could have been used as a weapon against the international order, and especially in order to support the Palestinian cause. Together with that, there is the political component at the regional level. The fact that we can't just do, and apply these reforms internally. We have to fund and provide military and training and logistical support to different anti-colonial groups and independentist movements across the region and the world. And so Libya gets involved in South America with Palestinian groups. You name it, in Africa, everywhere. The IRA, Libya is very at the forefront of this anti-imperialist struggle. During this process, obviously, it's not that as Libya was trying to bring forward this model, the country was left alone. On the contrary, there is a backlash. That backlash starts with by the US putting Libya in the list of states sponsoring state terrorism in 1979. US unilateral sanctions start. Then there is the use of false flags, attacks, and baseless accusation on Libya. For example, Libya is accused of the Berlin bomb, the La Belle discotheque, on the basis of which the country then is bombed twice in Benghazi and Tripoli in 1986. Then there is the whole facade of a process and trial on Lockerbie, which never really takes place, or not immediately, yet on the basis of accusation presented by the US and the UK, Libya is put under sanction for decades. And then there is the gunboat diplomacy and funding of opposition groups. All this to say, and there is the war in Chad as well, where Libya thinks is supporting one of these anti-colonial groups that rejects French anti-imperialism, but then he finds itself having to fight Saudi Arabia, Israel, Sudan, the local collaborators, the US and France, and is defeated in that war. There is no other way to say it. So, this is the background to how you enter the late 80s, which is what? Libya is under immense pressure, geopolitical threat of war, actual bombings, incoming sanctions. And so what had started with as a very progressive period gradually starts to reverse. And, and that's where we enter basically the interviews then.
Yeah, and I mean, I think on top of that, I mean, I don't know fully where Libya sat within this, but you also have in that period, obviously China taking more of a sort of rightward turn a little bit, obviously. I mean, in terms of but also the Soviet Union falling, the Eastern Bloc, etc.
Absolutely.
And so, there's also, potential people that they could work with, etc., in different ways, even if I don't know whether were they non-aligned movement or were they
were they tried to remain non-aligned, but you're absolutely right to say that to lose, a counterbalance to the US, and so we are at the rise of the unipolar moment, not just Libya suffered that, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more. So you talked about Well, well, let's connect these two a little bit. So talk a little bit about how their anti-imperialists legacy, which you laid out there, I think pretty well, a good synopsis of it. Like, how does this then, in your view, start to relate to the everyday for folks? Maybe some of how do Libyans, what is this like for Libyans?
Yeah, this was a sort of a gradual process for me to find out, because when I started my interviews, the idea is that you are working on the past, on the history of the past. So why would you start? Why would you find people that are very suspicious to talk to you about the past? And so that's where thing started to take how do you say, a direction that I did not expect in my own research, which was this increasing level of violence and fear and surveillance. Now, if you are so willing to apply this and so keen and politically so how do you say, backed to apply these categories that we mentioned before, authoritarianism, stateless, and so on and so forth, you are going to explain all this in one way, which is they were living under a dictatorship. So right now, this is the continuation. It's normal. But there is a mismatch here, in the sense of I am trying to talk about something that is now gone, literally gone, because Gaddafi, we know what happened to him. He was brutally murdered, and his murder was televised. So why can't we talk about this? So two elements here. The first one was the fact that the suspicion towards me was as being an Italian, and also the idea that, and I talk about this in chapter 2 of the book, the idea that fear and violence weren't just something under which people were living. It was it was the nature of the relationship that the country had with a global order. And this is, this is very important to understand. So for a foreigner to start asking, what do you want from us? Why do you want to talk about the everyday? Then you need to start tracing back this relationship, not just at the level of as I said, at the local level, but you need to start moving as an onion. You need to unpeel the different layers. And why this is important? It's important because basically what I understood is that this, as the capitalists say, fears trickles down into the system, and so does surveillance and violence. Because the moment Libya tries to challenge the international order, like any other country was undergoing through decolonization and, pursuing a process of national liberation, Libya is crushed, is clobbered. How? As we said before, sanctions, gunboat diplomacy. So it's a material war in the sense that it actually involves military means, but it's an intellectual war as well, because by delegitimizing the government to the eyes of its own people, the people themselves then start thinking, oh, look, if we are in this situation, it's because of the government. So you create the foundations to delegitimize that government, not only at the international level, but also internally. And in that situation, the moment that you lay out the conditions for a government not to be able to satisfy its own people because it's under sanctions, social discontent, it's normal, because people can, they're seeing that life is not as it used to be before. At that point, the funding of opposition groups, and especially of Islamist groups,
Uh-oh, you muted for a second, I think. Sorry, while Mateo's figuring that out, I'll just say one of the things that happens in one of his interviews that he talks about is the
I'm here,
sort of
right?
referencing here. Yeah, you're good. I just say one of the things that happens in your interview, I'll let you continue, was like you had people like, is this guy, are you a spy? Like, what, why are you, and so, yeah, that's sort of what you're talking about when you're talking about the distrust also of you as an academic as you get into this question. But continue, please.
Sorry, Jared. I mean, I don't know what
No, you're
happened.
fine. You're fine.
So yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is that this relationship of suspicion, violence, and fear that the West was projecting over Libya and was purposely, pursuing in order to crush the country and to make sure that that kind of model of development was not being pursued because it was challenging, the hierarchies of the international order regionally and internationally. What happens is that the government then becomes under pressure, obviously, and it becomes its policies becomes inevitably much more repressive and also partly legitimate towards some of the population, including especially those groups that they have direct links with the West. And here I'm talking about Al-Muqatila, the Islamist groups, and so on and so forth. In all this also, I mean, we don't have to forget that the 1990s, as you said, rightly so, it's the collapse of the Soviet Union, but regionally is also the time that we're seeing the rise of Wahhabi Islam, the consolidation of the unipolar power of the US in the region, through its alliance with these two faithful allies, one being the Zionist entity and the other one the Gulf monarchies, that start funding also all kinds of Islamist groups, and we see this in Pakistan and Afghanistan and all over the region. And Libya is one of those places that is also targeted. And so in the book, especially in the chapter, we go into the details of what it meant to live in the everyday under the structure of fear, yet without forgetting where this fear was coming from.
Yeah, and so one of the dynamics there, and I think, you talk about this as you've just kind of laid out that external context, and I want to talk a little bit about the internal context because I think it is interesting too, and I think, for people who are interested in revolutionary political organization, it's something to kind of it's a dynamic that I don't think is unique to Libya at all, which is sort of like that you do get this, a culture where informing on people becomes something that people do for different reasons. You talk about that, you talk about how, people might join the revolutionary organizations, but not deeply believe in them, but there's a reason why they do that. And how some of these things relate to, like, you also give the example of people being taught the Green Book and just sort of like laughing at it or not taking it seriously, but then recognizing that they have to teach it. And so all of these kind of things go on, which I guess in some ways, like, also, degrade the ability of the revolution to actually be this progressive force too, not to put the weight there of the collapse upon them, but just to kind of understand that that's a problem too that starts to develop as a result of all these other, issues that you're laying out.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and this is where I go back to the necessity of having a dialectical relationship between the everyday and the structure under which the everyday is part of. Why? Because what we're seeing in that process is precisely these dynamics that I've been trying to categorize in the book through themes like violence, corruption, and then the future, the dreams, the ambitions, the fantasies for the future that people have. But it is inevitable, you need to read these three chapters as a totality of social relations because they are interconnected. Why? Because you see that the moment the country is increasingly under a geopolitical threat of war and sanctions, and is military defeated in Chad, the elites themselves start, undoing the progressive policies that had initially that had initially been pursued by the Libyan government. And in doing so, the military defeat translates into ideological defeat. So what was revolutionary in the 1960s and 70s and 80s all of a sudden becomes anachronistic. Why are we doing this? Why do we need to pay the price of being under sanctions? So you are seeing that the intellectual war and material war waged by imperialism is taking actually place, is winning to a certain extent, because the government, the elite themselves start to renounce to these policies, to this way of looking at the world, which ultimately what it is a fantasy of how Libya should look like in the future. In doing that, they start opening up the country to, for example, foreign capital, or not to the extent, and this is something that I have to remember, because sometimes we tend to make this, sweeping comparisons. Libya kept capital controls up to 2011. And similarly, never opened up the country to the extent that Egypt did, and had these huge pools of poverty in the country. In fact, the question of poverty in my own interviews, for example, and in the entire book, never comes up. Like, people were not, in a situation that they couldn't eat. But we will talk about that. What we're talking now is the fact that we're seeing this basically taking place. Legitimization and war on the country, the ideological defeat internally, and the people themselves, once they see that the elites are renouncing to this and they are actually becoming corrupt. And by corrupt, I mean, because even corruption is really a word that is misused. By corruption, I mean turning public property into private one and profit. In other words, socioeconomic inequalities increase inside the country. That's where you see the whole ideological structure becoming corrupt itself. And that's where you see people that, they're like, okay, we're doing this, but is this really useful? Like, reality doesn't match anymore the theory, the praxis. This is, at the end of the day, is historical materialism. We know the idea that, we are looking at the world, but the categories through which we are looking at the world does not match the reality that we are living. So we need new categories. And the category that starts to develop is corruption. But this shows, and this is not unique to Libya. This is, as I say every time I'm talking about this, I look at Italy right now, people talking about the public sector and hospitals. It's, you are laying the ground for the ideological ground for introducing eventually the complete privatization of the health sector. Why? Because people are like, it's not working. We have to wait. It's better to go there. This is absolutely corrupt. And that's exactly what was happening there. So this then translates into the abandonment of the idea of state, socialist modernity, and transforms into capitalist modernity.
Yeah, appreciate that. And let's see. So let's talk a little bit more about the aspirations that, you talk a little bit about chewing gum and chocolate in the text. And, this again, also, you connect these, but it connected for me too, of like, in undergrad, I had a great Soviet film teacher, and, we'd look at the period of like the 80s in Soviet film, and there's all these ways that, like, I mean, one, the black market, so-called, starts to become apparent in the films, but also these aspirations of pop music and, candy and things like that. So these material aspirations that people have. Obviously, you just connected it, so we know this is also what the elites are doing. They're now, one of the things that comes up is Dubai, right, as a model, and so, but people's aspirations get tied to these things too, and it continues the degradation, I guess, of the kind of ideological, because people want something else, but it's really like a kind of fantasy in terms of like what they want, because they don't, it's, nobody really wants neoliberalism.
It's true, Jared. I mean, I think there are two aspects to these questions that are important to highlight. The first one is that the process is gradual, and as much as you see a military and ideological defeat taking place throughout the 90s, especially under the pressure of sanctions and isolation, you also see the capacity of the government to introduce and to change the way it's doing its own it's pursuing its own political strategy, which is, again, this is precisely the capacity of understanding that reality is changing, and with that we need to change also the tools that we are using to describe it. And the Libyan government is able to do that. with some contradictions, obviously, that remain. But this is what I try to highlight in chapter 4. And I think these are the models of Sirte and Dubai, in a way. Why? Because what we see when I talk to people was this idea that everybody was telling me, oh, why we have so much oil? Why can't we be like Dubai? Or this story that I had no idea was going to come up so recurrently throughout the interviews about Sheikh Zayed, the ruler of the UAE. In the 1970s, he visited Libya. He wanted to transform Dubai in like Libya, and look at us now. Look at Dubai and look at Libya. The wheel, the wheels of development has spin the other way around. How did we reach this point? And let's talk about this. So the idea is that Dubai becomes the fantasy for many of the people at the everyday level, because they are in a way feeling the crush of the sanctions. They think that the country can reach more, and they believe that the idea of a sort of a Islamist capitalist model can work a la Dubai. What is not being told, and what all the interviewees, do not consider, is that to be like Dubai, it means to renounce to your national sovereignty, to renounce to the Palestinian cause, to renounce to a certain project of regional solidarity, because you are giving up to imperialist orders, basically. Because we know the structural role that the Gulf plays in the US-led imperialist order. So that never comes up. And similarly, nothing comes up when people keep talking about and looking at the past through the lens of scarcity. They look at the past through the lens of scarcity because they think of the future through the lens of capitalist modernity. So I am looking back and I'm not thinking, we are under sanctions. This is why we can't eat chocolate. This is why chewing gum is prohibited. I am looking at the past and say, my God, we didn't even have chewing bananas. Can you imagine? Why? Because the way you're looking at the future has changed. You are not looking at socialist modernity anymore. You are actually blaming socialist modernity because, it's not providing what it could instead. And that's why capitalist modernity becomes this, this futurity in a way for people. But the Libyan government, as I was saying, this idea of Dubai, which eventually was magnetized by a certain part of the elites, what they were called the reformers, and, and led by one of the sons of Muammar Gaddafi being Saif al-Islam, was also counterbalanced by another project, which was really key for Libya to come out of the embargo and the sanctions, which was building the idea of Sirte, what I call Sirte. Why Sirte is important? Because Sirte is the capital in 1999 in which a major meeting takes place among states of Africa to relaunch the project of the African Union. And the states of Africa themselves break the embargo by flying into Libya. So, and this is where I'm seeing, and I also discussing with some of my colleagues, you see Libya actually, you could say, spearheading a moment of multipolarity during those years, because it's capable to looking at the world and say, we need Dubai, in a way, we need a little bit of opening up of the country, but we need to stay also true to our own values and continue this regional project of solidarity. And so these contradictions, it's not like, as the literature poses, is, oh, look, they were fighting, Libya didn't know what they were doing, and so on and so forth. These are exactly the contradictions that we, progressive people need to understand when we are looking at reality. Libya was trying to counterbalance this moment of international isolation while promoting also an agenda of regional solidarity. And it was fascinating in my current research I'm seeing is that back in the 70s and the 80s, anti-imperialism was the key word. By the 90s and the 2000s, the revolutionary literature, which is not even called revolutionary anymore, is talking about American globalization. It's a different way really to understand the world, but also understand the type of forces that we need to counter in ways that, do not, might not uphold to our theoretical ambitions, but certainly are really trying hard to work with the material existing contradictions of the reality.
And this is where you see people being split inevitably among these two models, because they are split. Some, they think that Sirte was the way to go. Other thinks that Dubai was the model and the fantasy to pursue. And the same thing takes place when looking at the figure of Saif al-Islam, inevitably.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I also, it was interesting in the text too, how Dubai, right, that they could sort of sidestep the question of the West through Dubai, right? So that it wasn't, because they understood on some level, right? It's why they had suspicion of you, right? Like they understand the role that Europe and the United States and whatnot have played, but Dubai plays this other. I mean, obviously, Dubai is a Western capitalist, but it is this hybrid, right? Because it's like, okay, well, it's an Arab state, it's Islamic, and so it's more like us, right? And it's a different approach. And look at what they have built, etc. And it gets away. I just thought that was interesting. I mean, probably that's like the empire's wildest dream. It's sort of like I mean, we look at what's going on with Palestine right now and like the role that different Arab and Gulf states and stuff like that are playing. And I think it was Max Eil called Qatar the United States' most sophisticated proxy, and that line kind of sticks with me. Yeah, anyway, so let's talk about then 2011. We've kind of laid a lot of the background, and maybe we should talk a little bit more also. I don't know. Let's talk about it. Let's just talk about kind of what is your understanding of this moment, in relation to the regime, some of the reformism that has started to happen, the geopolitical aspects of this revolt, and the death of Gaddafi.
2011, I mean, probably I should start from what I didn't say yet, which is the fact that what comes as chapter 5 that tries to capture the profound division and actually the epistemological violence that I found when I was interviewing people. Because when I started this project, I was trying to ask about the past, but naively, I didn't understand back in the days that to talk about the past, you are going to position yourself vis-a-vis the present. So in that moment, considering the violence and the NATO intervention, and then the civil war taking place, and basically all this violence taking place in the country, people weren't just talking about the past. They were going to talk about the past according to their vision of what had happened in 2011. And, the benefits or the disadvantages that followed what happened in 2011. So in a way, chapter 5, which is the last chapter, comes really in my own interviews at the start. But it was the leading up that made sense to restructure it. But that's what I faced right away, to the point that I decided to change the interviews in a way that I was asking people, oh, what do you think happened in 2011? Precisely because once they position themselves clearly vis-a-vis that event, then you can go back and talk about it. 2011, what did I find? What can we say about 2011? 2011 shows us the limits of, first and foremost, we have to talk about the Arab Spring, or what is called the Arab Spring. Because looking back, that moment has been so romanticized that actually I think what happened in 2011 is going to be remembered as one of the biggest civil war taking place in the Arab region, ideologically and militarily. Something that, you see the protest in the Arab region about social reforms. Palestine is completely diluted, is not there anymore. And then you see all these Islamist groups coming up, eventually taking even power, and many of them even being funded by external powers. So it is, and let's not forget Obama's speech in Cairo where he's talking about the new Middle East. I mean, so to look at this period of history and just think of it as some major Arab moment of revolution, you really have gone in, it's just oniric, according to me. You can't do that. You have to sit, and look at how things developed and realized that this was a major moment to really shape the region into a certain direction, which I eventually, when we see at October 7, I have to say it failed. But in any case, what we're seeing now is that what we're seeing in 2011 in Libya is the country is majorly polarized, because you see this gradual process that has been taking place for years. You know, the renouncement of this idea, or to this idea of revolution, which now sounds very anachronistic. And at the same time, the creation of strong, large pockets of discontent among the youth, especially, that they haven't lived the years of independence and national liberation, but they're looking at the present and the country also through a generational, you know, passing of surveillance. We can talk about politics and so on and so forth. So on that front, that protests could take place in Libya, there is absolutely nothing abnormal, like any other country. You know, in France, it's happened worse, honestly, with the yellow vest, but NATO didn't come in. So we know protests are actually a sign of a healthy society. The problem is that when we look at the history, you know, and the material history under which Libya is, you know, and the structural conditions which Libya is part of, what we see is that if protest and discontent, and also this kind of rejection of the government, somewhat considered too ideological agenda of anti-imperialism, there is also another element that has been constantly present in the history of Libya, which is foreign interference. And that is a given. You know, anybody who starts to talk about 2011 without talking about foreign interference, then is an agent. That's my conclusion. Because you cannot talk about what happened in Libya without talking about the interference that took place and weaponized these minor contradictions inside the country to arm groups, to send troops, and in a 1 month period call for the R2P to be used in order to create a fly zone and eventually carpet bomb Libya, even with depleted uranium, by the way, especially in the area of Bab al-Azizia where the government was residing. So this must be really remembered. No matter, how contradictory was the everyday, this means that the everyday has always been part of that structure. And at any moment, the global structure, the imperialist structure, has used these contradictions, creating them as well, because let's not forget that, the intellectual war that we talked about earlier was laid through geopolitical threat of war and sanctions. So uses these contradictions in 2011 to basically carry out a regime change, NATO-led operation. And that's where Libya, now we come to the present, to the destruction of the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't even know where to go from there. I mean, this has kind of been the scope of the conversation that we laid out, and I appreciate you laying all out. We have a few minutes. Is there one, if folks have questions in the chat, feel free to drop those in, and we could take a couple. I don't know if there, I mean, is there anything that you want to say about sort of the present more? I know it's not the topic of the book. And in some ways in the book, part of what I see you doing is always, just connecting the present to the past too. But obviously you have the assassination, of Gaddafi. Some of the forces, are still the same in some way. I mean, like his son, right? Saif is still, isn't he a significant figure still? And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that's not the topic of your research, but I don't know, as we're waiting, if people want to ask any questions, if there's anything you want to say on that.
There is two things that I do want to say. One is that Libya has been destroyed. There is no other way of saying it politely. Libya has been carpet bombed. The society is way worse than it used to be. And what happened is a Dubaification of the mentality. The Gulf intervened. The Gulf powers are major powers who are trying to divide up Libya. Turkey's in. So Libya is really now up for grabs. Libya has been destroyed. We have to face this. It's like what happened to to Yugoslavia, what happened to many other countries that NATO has aggressed over the years. So Libya is destroyed. But this is where, we have to look differently. We tend to look at Libya in relation to the Arab region, okay? Because of the history of Pan-Arabism, which was probably the most anti-imperialist and progressive moment. But the fact that, the government started to look at Africa in the 1990s and in the 2000s has had a major impact. And you know where? In the coup d'etat in West Africa. Because that's the anti-imperialist legacy of, we have to say, the Libyan Arab Jamahiriya and Muammar Gaddafi. That's very important, because when we look at Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, all these countries had their conditions, their political conditions worsening after the destruction of Libya, where all these jihadi groups started to be harmed, the weapons started to flow in their own countries. France, insisted in launching military Operation Barkhane in 2014 all over the Sahel in order to stop these terrorist operations. And these countries, they never had a national liberation moment, because they always had a nominal independence negotiated with France. So when we see Traoré mentioning Muammar Gaddafi in his ideological outlook, and he remembers what happened to Libya in 2011, this is where the anti-imperialist legacy of Libya now resides. It might not reside in Libya, which I don't think it does anymore, not at this stage, but certainly has been taken up by African states right now that are posing a major challenge to the imperialist order.
No, that's very interesting. I appreciate that. Well, it doesn't look like I'll give folks a couple more, a little bit. If you have questions, go ahead and get them in. Just want to say thank you so much for this conversation. I look forward to having more with you. I do want to say to folks, I highly recommend the book. I mean, there's a lot that we didn't get into, that you really do go into, and yeah, I mean, I think that's I think that's all that I have. But I really appreciate the conversation, Matteo.
Thanks, Jared. I mean, it's my pleasure. So anytime, and if there are questions, that's okay. But otherwise, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
All right. Well, it doesn't look like we have any, but that's okay. And so yeah, again, we'll be in touch. Hopefully we'll do this again. And definitely recommend the book, and we'll look forward to watching your other work. For folks who are looking, I think you recently had a conversation with Electronic Intifada, right?
That's
And
right,
then
yeah.
you've done some stuff with our friend Sina on the East as a podcast, and some other things too. So if folks want to, follow also, your social media name is Capasso Matt. So it's like, you take his last name and then put the first three characters of his first name, and you can get that. And
That's
so yeah,
right.
I hope people will continue to follow your work, and see the other things you're doing, because it's very, very important interventions that you're making. So thank you again, Matteo. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Jared. Thank you. My pleasure.